Every summer, they come to the mountains by the millions, to the granite and the snowfields, the alpine lakes and the thin high air, the country that looks in a photograph like the closest thing on earth to heaven. The overwhelming majority come home. They peel off their boots in the trailhead lot, sunburned and aching and glad of it, and they drive back down into the ordinary world, carrying nothing stranger than a phone full of pictures. But not all of them. Every year, across the great ranges of North America, a small and stubborn number of people walk up into the peaks in fair weather, well within reach of the ones they love, and the mountains close over them without a sound, and they are never seen again. They are not, for the most part, the reckless or the unprepared. They are seasoned climbers and weekend day hikers, trail runners and grandfathers, the fit and the careful and the well-equipped. They step off a path to photograph a lake, or walk a few minutes ahead of the group, or set out alone on a route they have climbed a dozen times before, and something happens that no search has ever been able to name. What follows is almost always the same. The car left standing in the lot, the frantic call after dark, the search that swells from a handful of rangers to hundreds of volunteers with dogs and helicopters and heat-seeking cameras. And then, more often than the agencies like to say aloud, nothing, no body, no gear, no answer, only a name added to a quiet list, and a family left standing at the edge of a question that has no bottom. This is a countdown of 15 mountain ranges where exactly that has happened. 15 real ranges and 15 real people who went up into them and did not come down. We begin in the granite heart of Idaho. In the middle of Idaho, in a state much of the country still pictures as a single flat blank of potato fields, there is a range of mountains so sharp against the sky that the first settlers who saw it reached for the only word that fit. They called it the Sawtooth. From the valley floor near the little town of Stanley, the peaks rise in a serrated gray wall of granite, dozens of summits above 10,000 feet. Their skyline is clean and cruel as the teeth of a ripsaw, laid edge up against the clouds. And behind that first wall the range does not end. It folds back on itself for mile after roadless mile, a labyrinth of spires and cirques and hanging valleys, of talus slopes the size of small cities, of glacier-carved granite basins holding somewhere close to 400 alpine lakes, each one lying in the rock like a coin of spilled mercury. It is among the most beautiful places in the United States. It is also, once you have left the maintained trail and dropped over a single ridge into the next drainage, one of the easiest places in the country to cease to exist. The country here is protected, and it is genuinely wild. In 1972, Congress drew a line around some 750,000 acres of it and called the whole the Sawtooth National Recreation Area, and at its heart set aside the Sawtooth Wilderness. Better than 200,000 acres with not a single road through it. A place you can only enter on foot or on the back of a horse. The high point, Thompson Peak, stands a little over 10,700 feet. Around it, the range throws up hundreds of lesser summits and unnamed towers, and between them it hides a tangle of drainages that all look, from the trail, like the way you came. That is the first thing to understand about the Sawtooth, and it is the through line of everything still to come in this film. The danger of a range like this is not the summit. It is the ground between. The maintained trails are narrow threads stitched through an enormity of granite and timber, and a person a quarter-mile off one of them, down in the wrong basin, has stepped into country where the terrain itself becomes the trap, where a twisted ankle or a wrong turn or a single afternoon storm can turn a day hike into a place a body lies for years. The southern reach of the range, where it spills down into Boise County, is wilder still. Here the crowds of Redfish Lake and the Alice Toxaway loop thin to nothing, and the trailheads grow lonely, and the drainages, the Queen's River among them, climbed steeply up into a backcountry of granite benches and cold blue lakes that most visitors never see. It was from the Queens River trailhead in June of 2016 that a hiker named Jack Thomas walked up into the Sawtooth wilderness and did not walk out. The alarm went up when he failed to return, and the response, by the standards of that empty corner of Idaho, was substantial. The Boise County Sheriff's Office mounted a search of the Queens River country. The kind of search these ranges demand: men and dogs working steep timber and talus, aircraft crossing a skyline that hides the ground beneath it. It ran for the better part of 2 weeks, and it found nothing. Not a boot print they could be sure of, not a scrap of gear, not a trace. The country simply closed over him, as this country does, and after a fortnight of turning up empty, the search was suspended, and Jack Thomas passed into that quiet catalog of the wilderness gone. A name, a date, a drainage, and no answer at all. For 7 years, that was where the matter rested. 7 summers came and went over the Sawtooth. The snow filled the high basins and melted out of them. The lakes froze and thawed, and the country kept its counsel. Then, in the summer of 2023, a party of backcountry hikers deep in the wilderness, near a remote alpine tarn called Benedict Lake, came upon something that did not belong in that emptiness. A wallet, clothing, a single hiking boot. They were far from any place a hiker leaves such things, and the hikers understood at once what they had likely found, and they carried word back out to the authorities. When search teams reached the site, the mountains gave up the rest of the story a piece at a time, the way they always do. An ice axe, an iPod, a cell phone, a day pack, a small satellite navigation device, the kind a careful hiker carries so that he will never be truly lost. And, at last, skeletal remains. Jack Thomas, found roughly half a mile off the maintained trail, 7 years and a few hundred yards from where the world had lost him. Investigators pieced together what they could. He had, it appeared, stepped off the trail to visit the high lakes that make this country worth the climb, and somewhere out there among the granite benches, something had gone wrong. A fall, an injury, a sudden turn the record can only call a tragic event, and he had been unable to go on. The mountains did the rest. And here is the thing that ought to keep you at the edge of your seat for the 14 ranges still to come, because it is the plain, cold shape of nearly every case in this film. Jack Thomas was not lost in some trackless wilderness 100 miles from help. He was half a mile from a trail. He carried a satellite navigation device. He had every reasonable tool of the modern hiker, and a search went looking for him within days. Dogs and aircraft, and men who knew the drainage. And still the Sawtooth held him in plain sight and just out of reach for 7 years. Not because the range is vast beyond comprehension, though parts of it are. Because a single ridge, a single wrong basin, a single quarter-mile of granite and down timber is all the wilderness needs. The country between the trails is the country that keeps people, and there is a great deal of it, and it does not advertise where it has put them. That is the lesson of the Sawtooth, and it is worth carrying with you all the way to the end of this countdown. You do not need an Alaskan ice field or 1,000 square miles of empty backcountry to lose a person completely. You need only a beautiful range, a step off the path toward a lake, and the ordinary bad luck that finds the careful and the reckless alike. The Sawtooth gave Jack Thomas back after 7 years, which in these mountains counts almost as mercy, because there are ranges on this list that took people just as prepared, just as close to the trail, and have never given anything back at all. One of them lies a day's drive south, across the Utah line, in a high wilderness that the people who live beneath it have taken to calling by a darker name. They call it the Uinta Triangle. If you look at the mountain ranges of the American West on a map, the pattern is almost universal. They are long, ragged spines of stone running north to south, carved by the slow retreat of ancient glaciers and the relentless grinding of tectonic time. The Uinta Mountains, however, are a geological anomaly. They are one of the few major ranges in North America that run east to west, a subtle, massive shift in orientation that has, for generations of hikers, proven to be a quiet, disorienting trap. Located in the northeastern corner of Utah, the Uintas are not the sharp, jagged teeth of the Sawtooth or the vertical, intimidating walls of the Cascades. They are, instead, a range of high, rolling plateaus and broad, lake-pocked basins, a landscape that looks from a distance like a gentle alpine park. The highest point in the state, Kings Peak, rises to over 13,000 feet, but it does so with a deceptive lumbering grace. This is the high Uinta's wilderness, a place where the scale is so vast that the human eye struggles to grasp it, and where the tree line is not a barrier but a gateway into a high, windswept tundra that seems to stretch forever in every direction. The terrain here is defined by an agonizing, repetitive sameness. Unlike ranges where the topography acts as a funnel, guiding a lost traveler toward a creek or a valley floor, the Uintas are a series of stacked, elevated benches. A hiker can crest a ridge, expecting to see a familiar landmark, only to be met with an identical vista of gray quartzite scree and subalpine meadows. The scale is immense. The wilderness area covers over 450,000 acres, much of it above 10,000 feet. This altitude brings with it the persistent, hidden danger of hypoxia and the violent, unpredictable nature of high mountain weather. In the summer, the Uintas are subject to heat-burst thunderstorms that can drop temperatures by 40 degrees in minutes, coating the landscape in a layer of sleet or hail that obliterates footprints and muffles sound. The sheer density of the lodgepole pine forests at lower elevations serves to trap and disorient, while the high, barren plateaus offer no shelter from the relentless, scouring winds that strip away heat and morale with equal efficiency. It is this very softness that makes the range so lethal. To the uninitiated, the Uintas look like a place where you could simply walk in any direction and eventually find a road or a town. The reality is that the wilderness here is enormous, a sprawling, featureless expanse of high plateaus and hidden, stagnant basins where a hiker can walk for days without crossing a single marked trail. Because of this, locals and reporters have long referred to the range as the Uinta Triangle. It is a nickname born of a grim, recurring reality. The number of hikers who have stepped into these basins and simply ceased to exist is far higher than the geography should account for. It is a place where the landscape itself seems to absorb those who enter it, leaving behind no scrap of gear, no footprint, and no clue as to where they might have gone. The case that solidified this reputation for many occurred in July of 2011. Eric Robinson, a 64-year-old Australian, arrived in Utah with the intent of traversing the Uinta Highline Trail. It is a monumental route, a 100-mile journey that skirts the crest of the range, crossing high passes and desolate tundra. For a man of his age and experience, it was intended to be the centerpiece of a summer of travel. He was well equipped, prepared for the high-altitude weather, and carried the kind of expertise that usually ensures a safe return. He began his journey near Chepeta Lake, intending to push westward toward the Mirror Lake Highway, a trek planned to last roughly 10 days. Then, somewhere along the high, exposed ridge systems that define the Uintas, he vanished. When he failed to appear at his intended destination, the search that followed was one of the most comprehensive in the history of the Utah wilderness. The scope was immense, spanning vast tracts of unforgiving high-altitude terrain. Search and rescue teams faced the brutal reality of the Uinta geography, the very features that made the range beautiful, the deep, glaciated valleys and the vast, undulating plateaus, made searching them nearly impossible. Ground crews dealt with boulder fields that required hours to traverse just a few hundred yards, and thick timber stands that obscured everything from the air. The operation utilized infrared-equipped helicopters, canine units, and expert trackers who scanned for the slightest disturbance in the moss or rock. Despite the deployment of many volunteers and specialized units, the searchers found nothing. The lack of clues was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire ordeal. There were no discarded food wrappers, no signs of a makeshift shelter, and no gear caches. In the end, a seasoned outdoorsman had simply vanished from a path he was well prepared to navigate, leaving no trace behind. Not a footprint in the soft silt of the basin, not a scrap of gear, not a single shred of evidence. The disappearance of Eric Robinson is not an isolated event. It is merely the most prominent in a long, unbroken history of similar losses. The records of the Uinta National Forest are populated with names that echo his. Melvin Heaps, who vanished in the same high country, and Lynn Simmons, whose trail ended just as abruptly. There is even the harrowing, lingering memory of a boy named Garrett Bardsley, who, in 2004, stepped away from a campsite near Cubrant Lake and was never seen again. These cases share a common, unsettling geometry. They occur in a landscape that, while beautiful, is so expansive and so uniform that it strips away the landmarks a human relies on to find their way home. The pattern of these disappearances often defies standard search theory. In most wilderness accidents, victims are found within a predictable radius of their last known point, or they leave behind a trail of breadcrumbs, lost equipment, discarded clothing, or tracks leading toward water. In the Uinta Triangle, however, the victims seem to vanish in situ. There is no singular, identifiable danger here. No massive avalanche field, no sheer cliff face, no obvious singular peril. Instead, there is the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the high plateaus where a sudden summer storm can drop the temperature to freezing in minutes, and where, if a person were to lose their orientation, they could walk for days in the wrong direction and never realize they were off the map. Experts have long pondered why this specific region produces such total disappearances. Some suggest that the Uinta's unique east-west orientation confounds a hiker's sense of direction, drawing them unknowingly into the vast, uninhabited interior of the range rather than back toward the populated corridors. The Uintas represent a specific kind of wilderness fear, one that resides not in the unknown, but in the deceptive familiarity of the landscape. It is the fear of being in a place that looks like a park, yet behaves like an ocean. When you are on the high tundra of the Uinta crest, you are exposed to the sky in a way that feels almost primitive, and when the clouds roll in, the horizon disappears. You are left in a world of gray mist and rolling, indistinguishable hills, and the path you are following seems to dissolve into the rock and the grass. For a hiker like Robinson, who had likely navigated mountain ranges across the globe, the winters offered no warning, no sudden, dramatic catastrophe, but rather a slow, absolute erasure. There is a cold, clinical permanence to the way the winters claim people. It is not a place that typically yields its secrets to the passage of time. Years later, the high basins remain as empty as they were the day the searchers walked out of them. The wind blows over the tundra, the snow gathers in the drifts, and the high lakes continue to reflect the sky. But the people who walked into them remain, for all intents and purposes, simply gone. The mystery of the Winter Triangle is not that people vanish, but that they do so with such total finality, leaving behind no trace that they were ever there to begin with. It is a testament to the fact that when a person is truly lost in a landscape of this size, the search for them is less a pursuit than a prayer, a desperate attempt to find a needle in a haystack that the wind has already scattered to the four corners of the earth. The Uintas, at least, are a wilderness 100 miles deep, a place a person can plausibly be lost. But there are ranges where the wilderness is not 100 miles wide, but a few hundred acres, and where the outcome is just as final. A boy can vanish within sight of a grand old lodge on a summer afternoon in front of his own family and touch off the largest manhunt the Northeast had ever seen. In the northern reaches of New York State lies the Adirondack Park, a 6-million-acre expanse that is, by any metric of wilderness, a strange and singular place. It is not a range of sharp, snow-dusted peaks in the mold of the American West. It is an ancient, weathered landscape of rounded summits, deep glacial valleys, and a forest so dense and monotonous that it seems to vibrate with a life of its own. At the heart of the park sit the high peaks, a cluster of mountains surrounding Mount Marcy, the highest point in the state, where the trees are stunted by wind and the rock is slicked with a permanent mossy dampness. It is a region of deep, dark hardwoods and impenetrable spruce thickets, of hidden bogs and lakes that appear on no map. To the uninitiated, the Adirondacks look manageable. They are not the jagged, vertical walls of the Rockies or the Cascades, but this appearance is the most dangerous deception of all. The topography of the high peaks is a maze of repetitive ridges and valleys, all wearing the same coat of green, where a person can wander for miles without ever seeing a horizon or a landmark to break the monotony. It is a place where the forest does not merely surround a hiker. It consumes the light, the sound, and the sense of direction, folding the world into a tight, disorienting loop of timber and stone. This is a landscape characterized by blowdown, tangled masses of fallen, rotting trees that create natural stockades, and treacherous slide areas where the soil can liquefy under heavy rain, swallowing evidence and movement alike. On the 10th of July in 1971, this vast and indifferent wilderness claimed a child in a manner that remains, more than 50 years later, a subject of profound and unresolved unease. The setting was the Santanoni Preserve, a remote and historic estate tucked into the foothills of the high peaks near the town of Newcomb. The camp was a sprawling grand relic of a different era, accessible only by a long, gated dirt road that wound through miles of state-protected woodland. It was a place where, in the high heat of a summer morning, the world felt small and secure. Douglas Legg, an 8-year-old boy, was part of a group of family members setting out from the Maine camp for a hike. The morning was clear, the air filled with the scent of damp pine needles and the distant low hum of the Adirondack woods. As the party prepared to depart, it was noted that the boy was not dressed for the hike. He was wearing shorts, and the route they intended to take was thick with poison ivy and heavy brush. A relative asked him to return to the camp, a short distance back along the path they had just traversed, to change into long pants. Douglas Legg turned back toward the house, a short and simple errand on a sunny morning. He was seen, and then, in the span of a few minutes, he was simply gone. There was no sound, no cry for help, no sign of any struggle or departure. When the family returned to the camp a short time later, he was not there. They searched the immediate grounds, then the edge of the woods, then the path he had been sent to walk. The panic that sets in during the first hour of a missing child case began to ripple through the preserve, and as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, the reality became impossible to ignore. A boy had vanished from a path he had already walked, in a place where he should have been safe, and the forest had provided no answer. The search that followed became a defining moment in the history of the Adirondack region. It grew with a terrifying velocity into a massive, multi-agency operation that remains the largest manhunt ever conducted in the northeastern United States. Hundreds of volunteers, local law enforcement, and state forestry agents descended on the Santanoni Preserve. The logistical challenge was staggering. The Adirondacks lack the clear, open vistas that allow for easy visual sweeps, and the canopy in July is a thick, light-stealing roof of deciduous leaves. They brought in tracking dogs that struggled to find a scent in the thick, humid air of the forest floor, where the scent of decomposing organic matter and the sheer density of the vegetation often masked human traces. Aircraft circled the canopy for weeks, their rotors beating against the silence of the mountains, while ground teams formed long human chains, beating the brush and combing through the dense, tangled undergrowth of the high peaks. They searched the bogs, the abandoned camp buildings, the shoreline of the nearby lake, and every ravine within a 10-mile radius. They looked under every fallen log and in every hollow tree. The search teams faced their own physical toll. The terrain in the Santanoni area is riddled with hidden drainage channels and sinkholes obscured by ferns. At night, the temperature would plummet, and the dampness would seep into the very marrow of the searchers. Yet they pushed on, covering the same ground multiple times to ensure no detail had been overlooked. For 33 days, the search effort continued, a relentless, desperate grid-by-grid examination of the landscape. And at the end of those 33 days, they had found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single footprint that could be confirmed as his. The Adirondacks had accepted the boy into their depths, and they had kept him with a finality that defied the scale of the effort to find him. The aftermath for the Legg family was a devastating vacuum. The lack of any forensic evidence meant there was no trail to follow, no witness to corroborate a sighting, and no body to provide closure. Over the years, the case file remained a fixture for law enforcement, revisited from time to time as search techniques evolved, though the sheer scale of the rugged, roadless expanse defeated every renewed effort in the deep backcountry. The mystery of Douglas Legg is not merely that a child was lost in the woods, it is the absolute, surgical precision with which he was erased from the world. There were no witnesses to his departure from the path, and no clues left behind of any kind. The official investigation eventually settled on the most harrowing of possibilities, that the boy, confused by the dense uniform growth of the forest, had veered off the trail, become disoriented, and wandered into the deep, trackless interior of the preserve. In the Adirondacks, this is a plausible, if terrifying, reality. A person can step 30 feet off a trail, turn in a circle, and lose the path forever. The terrain is a trap of repetition. Every hemlock looks like the last, and every rise in the ground hides another identical depression. It is a place where a person can lose the trail within yards and be drawn steadily deeper into a wilderness that seems to have no edge. But even this explanation leaves a hollow space in the record. The sheer speed of his disappearance and the fact that a massive, systematic search of the surrounding terrain turned up nothing suggests something more elusive about the way this mountain range conceals its secrets. This case is not an anomaly in the Adirondacks. The park has a long, undocumented history of disappearances where hikers, hunters, and explorers have simply vanished into the green. These cases often share a common thread. The victim is experienced or is in a location considered safe. The disappearance occurs in a matter of minutes, and the subsequent search, no matter how exhaustive, yields absolutely nothing. These disappearances resist easy explanation, and it is the total absence of any physical trace that has kept them unsettled for so long. The forest does not just hide the lost, it seemingly obliterates the path they walked. The case of Douglas Legg remains an open wound in the collective memory of the Adirondacks, a reminder that even in the most familiar settings, the wilderness retains a capacity for sudden, total silence. The searchers who walked those woods in the summer of 1971 eventually went home, but the questions they carried with them never left. They had looked into the green, tangled heart of the high peaks and seen nothing but their own reflections, a forest that refused to reveal what it had taken. The Adirondacks lost a child in the space between a trail and a front door. Far to the west, in the high desert of Colorado, a grown man with a tent and a fishing pole would step into a range the Spanish named for the blood of Christ and leave even less behind. The Sangre de Cristo mountains rise from the earth with a sudden violent grace that sets them apart from the broader rolling swells of the rest of the Colorado Rockies. They form a high, narrow wall that stretches for over 100 miles from the southern edge of the state down into the high desert of northern New Mexico, a serrated ridge that catches the sunset and holds it, glowing with a deep bruised crimson that inspired the Spanish to name them for the blood of Christ. To stand on the floor of the San Luis Valley and look up at that wall is to feel the scale of the world shift. From the valley floor, the peaks rise nearly 7,000 feet in a single, brutal jump, a jagged rampart of granite and metamorphic rock that holds within its folds some of the most technical and treacherous climbing in the American West. The Crestone Group in particular is a place where the mountain seems to have been shattered and stacked back together by a careless hand. The rock is notoriously loose. The couloirs are steep chutes of scree and ice, and the weather, which gathers in the valley and slams into the range with little warning, can strip the visibility from a summit in minutes. It is a cathedral of stone, beautiful and imposing, but for those who leave the marked trails to reach the high basins, it is a landscape that demands a perfection of movement that few can sustain. The geography of the Crestones is defined by its chaotic, vertical fragmentation. Unlike the more rounded, navigable peaks found elsewhere in the Rockies, this range is a labyrinth of gendarme towers, knife-edge ridges, and hidden cirques that act as natural traps for the unwary. The rock quality, predominantly fractured rotten granite, makes traditional climbing a gamble. A handhold that seems solid can disintegrate under the slightest pressure, sending a hiker tumbling into the abyss. Below the summits lie expansive talus fields, vast slopes of sharp, shifting boulders that act like a mechanical puzzle, prone to sliding and crushing anything that moves across them. In the autumn, these features are exacerbated by fierce winds that roar through the mountain passes, turning manageable trails into wind-whipped gauntlets where the temperature can drop sharply in a matter of minutes. In the mid-September of 2013, a hiker named Mark Stice, a man from Arvada, Colorado, who knew the high country and its rhythms, drove south toward the Sangres. He had planned a solitary trip, a few days of camping and fishing in the quiet, thin-aired reaches of the wilderness that sit beneath the shadow of Crestone Peak. He was a man who understood the stakes of the high country, and he set out with the gear of a veteran, a tent, a sleeping bag, the modest tools of a man who intended to spend his nights in the wild and his days navigating the granite benches that define the local topography. He was expected home by the 21st of the month. When the calendar turned and his car remained stationary at the trailhead, and when no word came from the silence of the peaks, the alarm was raised. What followed was a search that spanned more than a week, a coordinated effort by mountain rescue teams and volunteers who understood that in a range like this, time is the one commodity that cannot be recovered. The search and rescue operation was a logistical nightmare from its inception. Because the Crestone Basin is so geologically complex, searchers could not simply grid the area. They had to be inserted by helicopter onto narrow, unstable ledges or undergo grueling, multi-hour hikes into the backcountry just to reach the search zone. Teams from across the state converged on the San Luis Valley, utilizing K-9 units, drones, and high-resolution imaging. But the sheer verticality of the terrain neutralized these advantages. Shadows in the deep, narrow canyons created black holes in visual coverage, and the density of the alpine timber masked anything lying beneath the canopy. Every day, the search coordinators had to balance the intensity of the effort against the risk to the rescuers themselves. The possibility of a secondary accident, a searcher slipping on the loose scree or suffering from altitude sickness, was a constant looming reality that forced the operation to slow to a methodical, frustrating crawl. They pushed into the drainages around the Crestone group, a terrain defined by its verticality and its indifference. They combed the gullies and the ridges, the searchers moving in lines through timber that grows thick and dark, and over fields of talus where a single misstep can shift a ton of stone. The search eventually brought them to the site of his camp. It was a scene that haunts the files of every search and rescue coordinator in the West. A tent, pitched in the quiet of the high country, with a sleeping bag inside and a fishing pole resting nearby, exactly as if its occupant had walked a few yards away for water or a look at the view and would be back before the shadows lengthened. It was the furniture of a life, left standing in the open air, yet the man who had placed it there was gone. The searchers extended their perimeter, then doubled it, then widened it again, covering every square mile of the surrounding basin. Yet they found nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of an accident, no gear scattered in a path of retreat, and most importantly, no trace of Mark Stice himself. He had effectively vanished from the face of the mountain, leaving his shelter behind as a testament to the fact that he had been there, and leaving the mystery of his disappearance entirely untouched by the evidence the searchers had recovered. The aftermath for the family was a period of agonizing, indefinite suspension. Without a body, without a specific cause of death, the grieving process was denied its closure. Investigators pored over his gear, checking for signs of tampering, animal disturbance, or weather-related damage, but the tent remained undisturbed, a mute witness to a departure that defied logic. There were no footprints leading away from the site, no discarded items, no sign at all of where he had gone. The silence of the mountain absorbed him so completely that it felt as if he had simply stepped out of the physical world. The Sangre de Cristo is a place that has seen its share of tragedy, and the official records are filled with the reports of climbers lost to falls or succumbing to the exposure of a sudden, brutal September storm. In most of these cases, the mountain provides an answer. The terrain reveals the cause, and the search ends with the recovery of the lost. But the case of Mark Stice belongs to the other, colder ledger, the one that remains open because the range has not spoken. It is a landscape that is famously layered with history and local folklore, an entire valley beneath it that many believe holds something strange. But the mystery of his disappearance requires no ghost stories to be unsettling. It is unsettling because of the simplicity of the void. He was a man with a plan, a man with a home, and he was standing in the middle of a wilderness that, for all its beauty, offered him no path back. The tent stood there, a beacon of human intention in a landscape of geologic indifference, and that was all that remained. This pattern of disappearance, where a person leaves behind the artifacts of their existence only to vanish without a footprint or a final sighting, is the dark hallmark of the Sangres. It is a range that seems to possess a geographic blind spot, a quality where the topography is so hostile and so complex that it creates a psychological and physical barrier that renders search efforts impotent. Hikers disappear within sight of their own camps. Climbers vanish between one ledge and the next. Because of the vastness of the San Luis Valley and the jagged, inaccessible nature of the Crestone group, it is entirely possible for a person to fall into a crevice or slide into a drainage that is never touched by human foot, masked by the very rock that makes the mountain so alluring. The mountain does not just hide, it consumes. It is a place where the scale of human endeavor is dwarfed by the sheer, unyielding reality of stone. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the Sangre de Cristo when the wind dies down, a silence that seems to press against the ears. It is the silence of a place that does not care who comes to visit or who leaves behind their life in the shadow of the peaks. Mark Stice left a tent that is still, in a sense, waiting for him. But some ranges do not merely hide the people they take. They keep them, out in the open, where everyone can see the mountain and no one can reach what it holds. The next one buried 2 men on a single storm-lashed December night. Mount Hood stands as the great white anchor of the Oregon Cascades, a dormant volcano that lifts its glaciated crown more than 11,000 feet into the sky. To the millions who live in the Portland metropolitan area just an hour's drive to the west, it is a familiar presence, the backdrop to every horizon, a reliable feature of the landscape that changes its coat with the seasons, from the deep green of its lower forests to the brilliant, jagged ice of its summit slopes. It is one of the most frequently climbed glaciated peaks in the world, and its ease of access is, paradoxically, the source of its most persistent danger. Because it sits so close to a major city, and because its base is served by well-maintained roads and a historic, grand-timbered lodge, it attracts a constant procession of climbers who are sometimes lured into believing that the mountain is a manageable domestic thing. It is not. Above the tree line, Mount Hood is a high-altitude wilderness defined by sheer ice, rapidly shifting weather systems, and vertical terrain that can turn a pleasant morning ascent into a life-threatening ordeal in the time it takes for a cloud to obscure the sun. The geography of the North Face, the site of the 2006 tragedy, is particularly unforgiving. Unlike the more popular South Side route, which tracks a relatively straightforward path, the North Face is a chaotic labyrinth of hanging glaciers, unstable séracs, and steep, rock-strewn gullies. The terrain here is vertical, defined by the Elliott Glacier, which serves as a constant grinding river of ice. The scale is deceptively massive. To the eye, the summit appears within reach. Yet the actual distance involves navigating unstable snow bridges and steep ice pitches that demand perfect conditions. In the winter, this environment transforms into a hostile, alien realm, where the sunlight is fleeting and the temperature gradients cause the mountain to shed its skin in the form of frequent, unpredictable avalanches. It is a landscape that demands total self-reliance, as the physical geography effectively isolates anyone who wanders beyond the established paths. The lethality of this mountain is well documented, but few instances have etched themselves into the collective memory of the climbing community as deeply as the events of December 2006. That month, 3 seasoned climbers, Kelly James, Brian Hall, and Jerry Nico Cooke, attempted the mountain's north side, a route that demands technical skill and a respect for the volatile nature of the high-altitude environment. They set out as a winter storm began to gather on the horizon, a massive, swirling front that would eventually bring wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour. As they ascended into the upper reaches of the mountain, the weather conditions deteriorated with a ferocity that defied simple description. The sky vanished behind a driving, blinding wall of white, and the temperature plummeted, turning the rock and ice into a landscape of frozen, kinetic violence. High on the mountain, near the summit, the group found themselves in a state of crisis. Kelly James, for reasons that were ultimately attributed to injury or sudden severe decline, could no longer continue the ascent or the descent. In a desperate attempt to survive the onslaught, the men carved a snow cave into the side of the mountain, a small, hollowed-out refuge against a gale that was attempting to scour the peak clean. It was there, in that narrow, freezing space, that they made their final, harrowing decision. Brian Hall and Jerry Cooke, 2 experienced and determined men, resolved to attempt a descent down the north face to summon help for their companion. They left the shelter of the snow cave and vanished into the whiteout, leaving Kelly James to wait for a rescue that the mountain was doing everything in its power to prevent. In the hours that followed, the story of their struggle reached the outside world through the only medium left, a cell phone. Kelly James managed to make contact with his family, relaying the reality of his situation from that high, cold, and lonely shelter. The calls were gut-wrenching, providing a voice to the invisible figure sheltering in the snow cave near the summit. Then, the signal cut, and the mountain fell silent. The ensuing search was one of the most visible and complex operations in the history of the Pacific Northwest. For days, helicopters battled impossible turbulence, and ground teams, the men and women of local search and rescue, supported by expert volunteer mountaineers, pushed up into the storm. The difficulty of the search cannot be overstated. The wind chill factors were so severe that rescuers were forced to retreat repeatedly, and the sheer volume of new snow meant that any tracks or signs of the climbers were buried almost as soon as they were made. On the 17th of December, rescuers managed to locate the snow cave near the summit. Inside, they found the remains of Kelly James. He had succumbed to the cold. The mountain had kept him exactly where he had waited. But for Brian Hall and Jerry Cooke, the mountain provided no such conclusion. Despite an exhaustive multi-week effort that combed the ravines and the treacherous, crevassed slopes of the North Face, no trace of them was ever found. The search operation utilized high-tech thermal imaging, specialized avalanche dogs, and teams of climbers who risked their lives on the very same ice that had claimed the victims. The investigation into their disappearance was methodical, analyzing the probable trajectories of their descent and the patterns of the storm, yet it yielded nothing. They had stepped out of that snow cave into a world where the wind was strong enough to push a man off his feet, and the visibility was essentially zero. The prevailing consensus among those who searched is that they were likely swept from the face of the mountain by the storm, lost to the massive shifting glaciers that draped the peak. They did not leave a footprint for the search teams to find, nor a piece of gear, nor a final resting place that anyone could identify. They were simply erased. The aftermath for the families was a long, hollow period of waiting. There was no recovery, no closure, and no physical remains to bring home. The investigation eventually wound down, leaving behind only the cold reality of the mountain's indifference. These cases resist easy explanation because of the specific nature of the North Face. The glacier is a dynamic, moving feature. It does not stay static. It flows, cracks, and retreats, effectively acting as a tomb that is constantly being rearranged by the forces of geology and climate. This is a known, recurring pattern on Hood and similar peaks. Climbers vanish into the White Room, and the mountain consumes the evidence of their passage. It is not that they are necessarily lost in a supernatural sense, but rather that the scale of the environment is so vast that the human footprint is rendered insignificant against the backdrop of shifting ice. What makes this loss so haunting is the contrast between the three men. The mountain had claimed all of them, yet it surrendered one, while keeping two as its own. It is a reminder that even in a place where the infrastructure of civilization is visible from the slopes, the mountain itself remains a wild, indifferent entity. It does not care about the experience of the climber or the intent of the rescue party. It only knows the weight of the ice and the force of the wind. There are no mysteries about how they died. The storm was a verifiable, documented force of nature that broke the records of the region. But there is an enduring, chilling absence where those two men should be. They are part of the mountain now, folded into the ice that continues to move and grind, hidden in the vast vertical folds of the North Face. The tragedy of the North Face serves as a grim template for the reality of the American ranges. It shows that human effort, however well coordinated and brave, has a hard limit when faced with the sheer scale of the terrain. The mountain does not give back what it takes, and sometimes it does not even offer the courtesy of a grave. Hood kept two of its three in a single night of wind, and no one wonders why, only where. The mountain remains, an indifferent, jagged monument to those who ventured too high and met a silence that no search party could ever break. But there is a range in the east where the wind itself is the killer, on a summit that has recorded the worst weather ever measured on the surface of the earth. If the high ranges of the American West are defined by their scale, the Presidential Range in New Hampshire's White Mountains is defined by a different kind of hostility. It is a compact, brutal spine of ancient, weather-beaten stone, a place where a hiker can stand on a summit that is, by elevation, modest compared to the giants of the Rockies or the Sierras. Yet these mountains contain a geography of suffering that has been documented for nearly 2 centuries. At the center of this range stands Mount Washington, a jagged 6,000-foot peak that serves as the collision point for 3 of the most volatile storm tracks on the continent. Here, the air is frequently whipped into a frenzy that defies the logic of the valleys below. For decades, the winds measured at the summit were among the highest ever recorded on the surface of the earth, and the mountain is routinely cited in meteorology records as the home of the world's most unpredictable and punishing weather. The tree line here is unnervingly low, meaning that a hiker who ventures above the stunted spruce and balsam is instantly and entirely exposed. There is no shelter, no wood for fire, and often no visibility. In the Presidential Range, the danger is not the terrain's size, it is the fact that the atmosphere itself acts as a predator. This is a range that does not specialize in the quiet, lingering mysteries of the deep backcountry. It does not wait years to yield its secrets. Instead, it is a range of abrupt, violent encounters where the mountain asserts its dominance in an hour or less. Since the mid-19th century, more than 100 people have lost their lives on these slopes, victims of a landscape that can shift from a clear winter morning to an Arctic death trap before a hiker can reach the next cairn. The records of the Appalachian Mountain Club, which has maintained the trails here for generations, are filled with the harrowing accounts of those who were simply caught in the wrong place when the sky opened up. This is not a range that hides its dead in the shadows of hidden canyons. It is a range that leaves them in the open, exposed to the wind and the cold, as a testament to its singular intolerance for human presence. The topography is characterized by steep, rock-strewn ravines like the Great Gulf and Huntington Ravine, where the steepness of the terrain creates a vertical trap. Once a hiker enters these gullies, the escape routes are limited, and the wind, funneled through the mountain notches, can reach velocities that knock a person off their feet, making navigation of the boulder-strewn paths nearly impossible during a whiteout. On the morning of February 15, 2015, a 32-year-old woman named Kate Matrosova set out from a trailhead with the intention of completing a solo winter traverse of the northern Presidential Range. She was not a novice. She was a highly experienced and superbly fit mountaineer who lived in New York City, but spent her weekends training in the harsh environments of the Northeast. She had come prepared for the winter conditions, carrying the gear and the knowledge that usually makes the difference between an adventure and a tragedy. Her plan was a classic demanding route, a traverse across the summits of Mount Madison, Mount Adams, Mount Jefferson, and finally, Mount Washington. It was an ambitious itinerary, but for a hiker of her documented ability, it was within the bounds of what the trail allowed. The forecast for that day had been monitored, but in the White Mountains, the forecast is often merely a suggestion. As she ascended into the high country, an Arctic front surged across the range, transforming the already frigid atmosphere into a chaotic, blinding, and lethal force. By the time she reached the exposed ridges, the temperature had plummeted far below zero, and the wind speed, measured at various points along the traverse, began to gust well over 100 miles per hour. At those speeds, the wind chill factor drops into a range that the human body can sustain for only a matter of minutes. The terrain itself became a vacuum of energy. On the ridges between peaks, there is no leeward side, no natural break in the granite walls to offer a reprieve from the kinetic energy of the storm. The alarm was raised when Matrosova activated a personal emergency locator beacon during the afternoon of the 15th. The signal was received, but the mountain had already effectively sealed itself off. The rescue response that followed was heroic in its desperation. Search teams from across the region mobilized, but they were forced to battle the very same gale-force winds and whiteout conditions that had trapped the hiker. The search effort itself became a high-risk operation, with rescuers pushing into the Great Gulf and the high coals, moving through temperatures that threatened to incapacitate them before they could make progress. They spent the night in a state of absolute, harrowing uncertainty, knowing that the environment was actively working against them with every passing second. The logistical challenge was staggering. The sheer weight of the snow and the intensity of the wind made standard search patterns impossible, as visibility remained near zero for the duration of the initial deployment. Rescuers were forced to navigate by GPS and dead reckoning, moving along narrow, ice-slicked ridges where a single slip could result in a fatal slide into the abyss. They battled through the night, but the mountain held its ground, refusing to yield the location of the lost hiker until the winds finally relented enough to allow for a more systematic sweep of the high alpine zone. On the following day, the search teams reached the area near Star Lake, a small, desolate body of water nestled in the high col between Mount Madison and Mount Adams. It was there, fully exposed to the relentless freezing gale, that they found her. Kate Matrosova had succumbed to hypothermia, the cold having overwhelmed her despite the equipment she carried and the experience she possessed. There was no mystery surrounding the cause of death. It was a clear, tragic case of exposure on a mountain that had proven, once again, that it does not negotiate with those who walk its ridges in winter. Her death was documented, her body was recovered, and the official reports served as a sober, widely studied warning to the climbing community about the deceptive speed at which the presidential range can turn lethal. Her husband and family were left to reconcile the loss of a woman who had meticulously planned, calculated, and prepared for the conditions, only to find that the mountains operate on a scale that renders human preparation moot. She had not fallen and had not lost her way. She had simply been overcome by the cold and the wind in the open above the trees. There is an inherent, chilling dignity in how the presidentials handle those they claim. The mountain does not offer the haunting, open-ended absence of the western wilderness. It demands a reckoning, and it presents that reckoning to the rescuers who risk their lives to reach the scene. The horror of the presidential range is not the unknown, but the absolute certainty of the elements. It is a place where a person can be doing everything right, properly equipped, physically capable, and meticulously planned, and still be rendered obsolete by the sheer unthinking power of the wind. The presidentials kill in the open and give the body back, leaving the living to ponder how quickly the line between a hiker and a casualty can vanish in the spindrift. The presidentials do not specialize in the lingering, open-ended mysteries of the deep backcountry. Here, the danger is the raw violence of the weather, and the record of it is long and well documented. But the mountains keep their power to unsettle all the same. A few hundred miles north, on the same Appalachian spine, a 66-year-old woman stepped off the trail for a moment, survived for weeks, and was not found for 2 years. A reminder that even when the weather is still, these mountains can hold a person in a silence that lasts, and that in the high country, the boundary between the hiker and the landscape is thinner than stone. The Appalachian Trail is not a wilderness in the way that the high granite ranges of the West are wilderness. It is a path, a 2,100-mile thread of white blazes stitched across the spine of the American East. A trail where you are rarely more than a day's walk from a town, a road, or another person. It is a social geography, a corridor of hikers and hostels and community. Yet there are stretches in the high woods of western Maine where the mountains are just wild enough, just dense enough, and just indifferent enough to swallow that illusion whole. These are the Bigelow and Longfellow ranges, a country of low, tangled summits and valleys choked with spruce, fir, and bog. Here, the canopy is so thick that it creates a permanent emerald twilight, and the forest floor is a chaotic mattress of blowdown and moss where a person stepping 10 yards off the trail is not merely out of sight. They are erased. The terrain here is deceptive. It lacks the dramatic sheer cliffs of the Rockies, but it possesses a suffocating, repetitive geometry. The topography is a labyrinth of undulating ridges and hidden drainages where the ground is a treacherous carpet of root balls and slick, moss-covered stone. In the Longfellows, the forest is not a cathedral. It is a claustrophobic enclosure of stunted, tightly packed conifers that act as a visual baffle, turning every direction into an identical shadow. In the summer of 2013, a 66-year-old hiker named Geraldine Largay, known to her friends as Jerry, was nearing the end of a long-held dream. She was a section hiker, a woman who had spent months methodically walking the trail in stages, and she was only a few weeks away from completing her journey. She was experienced, she was prepared, and she was on the most documented, most traveled footpath in the United States. On the morning of July 22nd, the trail led her into a remote, heavily forested section of the Longfellow Mountains, just south of the town of Stratton. It was a stretch of the trail that abutted land used by the U.S. Navy for survival training, an area of dense timber and confusing topography that felt far more remote than its proximity to the trail suggested. This particular buffer zone, known for its unyielding, trackless character, was a place where navigational errors were compounded by the lack of clear horizon lines. Sometime that morning, Jerry Largay stepped off the path to relieve herself. It was a routine, momentary departure that every hiker makes thousands of times. She walked into the thicket, and when she turned to return to the trail, the landscape had shifted. In the dense, uniform spruce forest of western Maine, there are no distant landmarks to orient oneself by, no high peaks to sight against, only the repetitive, suffocating wall of green. She could not find the trail. She wandered, and as the afternoon wore on, the panic of the realized mistake set in. She pulled out her cell phone. She was in a place where the signal was notoriously thin, nearly non-existent, but she tried to send a text to her husband. The signal failed. She climbed to a higher elevation, hoping to find a connection, but the forest was a tomb for radio waves. The messages never went out. What happened next is one of the most quiet, devastating stories in the annals of the Appalachian Trail. Jerry Largay did not perish in a fall or a sudden accident. She did not vanish into thin air. She walked into the woods, realized she was lost, and she set up a camp. She had the presence of mind to build a shelter, and she began a journal, a record of her final weeks that would later be recovered by investigators. The journal, as later described by investigators, showed a woman who was not lost to madness or injury, but who held to her routine and her hope through a long and lonely wait. She waited. She moved carefully. She documented her days. Her writing, as later described by officials, painted a portrait of a person who remained faithful, who held on to the hope of rescue, and who survived in the Maine woods for at least 26 days. She fashioned a makeshift lean-to out of branches and her tent, attempting to signal for help, but the dense canopy above her acted as a natural shroud, rendering her invisible to the aerial reconnaissance teams that would soon be scouring the region. When she failed to reach her planned rendezvous, the search began. It was a massive, multi-agency effort involving the Maine Warden Service, scores of volunteers, and aircraft sweeping the corridor. They searched the trail. They searched the surrounding timber. and they searched the nearby bogs. They looked for a woman who was, at the time, still alive in her tent, just a mile or two from the very trail they were patrolling. But the terrain in that part of Maine is a fortress of thick, low-lying spruce that effectively masks anything beneath it. The searchers moved past her again and again, their eyes scanning the ground, never suspecting that the person they were looking for was sitting in the shadow of a tree, waiting to be found. The complexity of the search was exacerbated by the sheer scale of the Maine backcountry. It was a search for a needle in a haystack, where the haystack was an unending, jagged sea of conifers. The Warden Service deployed K-9 units and specialized trackers, but the heavy, damp forest floor, saturated by frequent rains, played havoc with scent trails, washing away the fleeting clues of her passage. The search eventually failed, the trail reopened, and the mountains closed over the mystery of her absence. The search for Largay remains one of the most sobering case studies in wilderness rescue history, illustrating the proximity paradox, the idea that one can be lost in plain sight. Following the suspension of active search efforts, the investigation transitioned into a long-term cold case. Her family lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty, caught between the hope that she had somehow walked out and the grim reality that she had not. For 2 years, the Longfellow Mountains kept the secret. It was not until October 2015, more than 26 months after she had stepped off the trail, that a forester conducting a survey for the U.S. Navy stumbled upon a collapsed tent in a remote section of Reddington Township. Inside were her remains and the final handwritten pages of her journal. The medical examiner concluded that she had died of starvation and exposure, a conclusion that underscores the sheer, terrifying endurance she had displayed. She had been found in a place that searchers had technically covered, yet had missed by a margin that defies easy explanation. It was a grim testament to how the Maine wilderness can render human presence completely null, absorbing evidence of life into its own natural cycles of decay. The case of Jerry Largay forces a confrontation with a cold reality. We believe we are tethered to the world by our technology and our mapped trails, but the wilderness recognizes no such connections. A trail is only a line on a map, and the world just inches beyond it can be as vast and impenetrable as the deepest interior of the continent. She was a mile from the most walked footpath in America, and it still took 2 years and a stranger's chance arrival to bring her story back to light. The Maine woods did not want to let her go, and in the end, they only relinquished her when the forest itself had finished its work. Her disappearance is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a persistent, haunting pattern of vanishings in the Appalachian chain, a series of cases involving experienced hikers who vanish in sections of the trail characterized by dense, uniform timber and deceptive, rolling terrain. These cases resist explanation because they lack the smoking gun of a grisly attack or a sheer cliffside fall. They are instead silent, slow-motion tragedies that unfold in the blind spots of human perception. The Maine Appalachians are a reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn into the unknown. But there are places in this country where the scale of the landscape is even more unforgiving, where the elevation is not measured in thousands of feet, but in miles of jagged, high-altitude ruin. Out in Colorado, in the heart of the San Juan Mountains, a place of razor-sharp ridges and massive, unstable slopes, a runner would one day set out to climb a 12,000-foot peak, and only one of them, his faithful dog, would ever come down. In the southwestern corner of Colorado, the earth does not merely rise, it shatters. The San Juan Mountains are not a single ridge or a modest line of peaks, but an immense fractured sea of 13,000 and 14,000-foot summits, a chaotic architecture of volcanic geology that stretches for thousands of square miles. It is one of the largest and most rugged ranges in the American Rockies, a place where the valleys are carved into deep, shadow-drenched gorges, and the ridges are composed of loose, rotten rock that defies the foot. To hike here is to enter a world that feels as if it were forged in a state of violent, ongoing creation. Between the high tundra and the timberline, the San Juans contain the Weminuche Wilderness, the largest designated wilderness area in the state, a vast expanse of roadless, storm-racked country where the weather can turn from a blue sky morning to a barrage of lightning and hail in the time it takes to eat a sandwich. It is a range of immense, terrifying scale, and it is a place that does not forgive a mistake, no matter how small or how brief that mistake might be. The terrain here is defined by what geologists call high-relief fragmentation. The San Juans are not composed of the monolithic granite found in other parts of the Rockies. They are volcanic, comprised of crumbling rhyolite and tuff that erode into treacherous scree slopes and hidden vertical chimneys. A hiker can stand on a ridge that appears solid, only for the ground to shear away under weight, sending them into a blind drainage. These drainages, or basin traps, are deceptive. They often funnel into box canyons where the walls are too steep to climb, and the vegetation, a dense, suffocating mix of lodgepole pine, subalpine fir, and jagged alder, creates a physical wall that can hide a human body from a rescue helicopter hovering a mere 50 feet above. In this wilderness, the vertical drop-offs are often masked by deceptive perspective, and the sheer scale of the landscape means that a person moving just a few hundred feet off-trail can find themselves in a labyrinth of crags that effectively isolates them from the visual horizon. The range draws seasoned mountaineers, but it also draws locals who know the terrain, who live in the shadow of the peaks and understand the rhythm of the high country. In the late summer of 2023, Rich Moore, a fit and experienced resident of Pagosa Springs, decided to make a climb that many in the region had made before, an ascent of Blackhead Peak. It is a remote, challenging summit, standing at roughly 12,500 feet, surrounded by miles of dense, high-altitude timber and undulating tundra that makes navigating by sight a difficult task for even the most practiced eye. On the morning of August 19th, Moore set out with his constant companion, a Jack Russell Terrier named Finney. He was not a tourist unaware of the peril. He was a local man who knew the temperament of the San Juans, and he carried the gear one would expect of a man who intended to spend a day in the high country. He walked toward the trailhead, he entered the timber, and he was never seen again. The search that followed was substantial and deeply professional, an operation that reflected the gravity of the San Juans. For days, then weeks, search and rescue teams from across the region combed the drainages and the ridgelines. They utilized the methods that define the modern wilderness search: ground crews on foot, search dogs trained to detect human scent, and aircraft scanning the high-altitude basins from above. The search teams were comprised of specialists who understood that in the San Juans, the search area is not a flat map, but a three-dimensional volume. They deployed drone technology to peer into the deep shadows of the northern slopes and utilized thermal imaging during the frigid dawn hours, hoping to catch a heat signature against the cooling rock. Yet, the terrain worked against them with a brutal efficiency. The San Juans are characterized by their verticality and their complexity. A person walking off a trail in these mountains can disappear into a drainage that is invisible from 100 yards away, obscured by the dense spruce and fir, or the shifting shadows of the high, steep walls. Search and rescue teams reported that even with dozens of personnel in the field, they were essentially blind to anything more than a few meters beyond their immediate line of sight. The searchers moved through the country with precision, yet they turned up nothing. No tracks, no discarded gear, no sign of a struggle or a camp. The mountains seemed to have simply swallowed the hiker and his dog whole, leaving behind no thread for the searchers to pull. The intensity of the search was hampered by the environment itself. The search teams had to navigate the same loose, shifting scree that had likely claimed more and every day spent searching was a day where the teams were themselves at risk of a fall or a weather-related emergency. They searched until the resources were exhausted and the probability of survival dropped to zero, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the weight of the missing. 10 weeks passed. The summer warmth gave way to the biting cold of an early Colorado autumn, and the high country of the San Juans began to close itself off to the coming winter. The case of Rich Moore began to settle into the quiet, heavy ledger of the unsolved. Families of the missing often described this period as a liminal state, a period of agonizing limbo where the lack of closure prevents the beginning of mourning. There were no clues to explain the disappearance, no trail cam footage, no pinged cell phone signals, only the vast, indifferent expanse of the Weminush. Then, at the end of October, a hunter navigating the remote backcountry roughly 2.5 miles east of the Blackhead Peak summit stumbled upon a scene that brought the search to a sudden, absolute conclusion. In a place where no one had thought to look, in a patch of wilderness that had been shielded by the immense complexity of the terrain, Rich Moore was found. The coroner's report, when it finally arrived, was as simple as it was devastating. The cause of death was exposure and hypothermia, the quiet, relentless result of a man who had become turned around in the high, unforgiving isolation of the range and had been unable to find his way back to the trail. The physical evidence suggested that Moore had succumbed not to a sudden injury or a fall, but to the slow, systematic degradation of energy and heat that occurs when one is lost in high-altitude terrain. But there was a detail in the discovery that moved the story beyond the statistics of a wilderness tragedy. Beside the remains of Rich Moore lay his dog, Finney. The small terrier was alive. He had survived 10 weeks in the high, brutal climate of the San Juans, enduring the wind, the freezing nights, and the scarcity of the high-altitude environment, never leaving the side of his companion. When the rescuers found them, the dog was gaunt, having lost nearly half his body weight, a shadow of his former self. Yet he had remained at his post through the entire duration of the search. The loyalty of the animal offered a haunting, human-centered coda to the mystery of why Moore had not been found sooner. He had simply been in a place so remote, in a fold of the mountains so deep and so removed from the established routes, that even the most exhaustive search grid had missed him by a margin of miles. The dog's survival raised impossible questions about how a small creature endured the early snows and the plummeting temperatures of the Colorado high country, serving as a living witness to a final, tragic act of devotion. The San Juans serve as a reminder that in these ranges, distance is not measured in miles, but in the difficulty of the ground. The range is a graveyard of the lost, where other hikers, such as young Ben Brownlee, have similarly been lost in the thin, high air, their stories ending in the same silent alpine expanse. These disappearances often share a chilling commonality. The victim is usually experienced, the weather is often decent at the time of departure, and the location of the remains is frequently discovered only by chance, often miles away from the intended path. It is a landscape that demands total attention, and it is a place where a hiker, no matter how capable or how prepared, can be rendered invisible by the simple, indifferent geometry of the rocks. The San Juans held Rich Moore for 10 weeks, and only his dog knew where. Far to the west, on the great lone volcano of Northern California, a man would climb toward the summit, step ahead of his friends, and be gone before they reached the top. Mount Shasta does not belong to a range in the way that other peaks do. It is a lonely, violent, and magnificent geometry, a singular stratovolcano that rises 14,179 feet above the Northern California landscape, dominating the sky for 100 miles in every direction. While it is technically the southernmost major giant of the Cascade Range, it stands aloof, severed from the other peaks by miles of lower broken country. Because it is so isolated, The mountain creates its own weather, pulling moisture from the Pacific and twisting it into lenticular clouds that cling to the summit like frozen caps. It is a place of extremes, a lower slope of thick, dark timber, a middle belt of volcanic scree and seasonal snow, and a high, unforgiving crown of rock and permanent ice. To the climbers who frequent it, Shasta is a test of endurance and technique. To the seekers who have been drawn here for generations, it is something else entirely. A mountain rumored to hold portals to hidden cities, to be a focal point for ancient energies, or to possess a consciousness that can lead a traveler astray. But beneath the lore and the mysticism, there is the hard, cold geology of the mountain itself, which cares nothing for the stories people project onto it. The terrain of Mount Shasta is deceptively complex. Below the alpine zone, the mountain is scarred by deep, glacially carved canyons and dense, old-growth forests that can disorient even experienced mountaineers. The scale is monumental. The mountain covers over 300 square miles, and its flanks are riddled with hidden lava tubes, subterranean voids, and vertical chasms obscured by loose surface debris. These geological features create a labyrinthine landscape where a fall of only 30 or 40 feet can drop a person into a hidden crevice or a chimney of volcanic rock, effectively rendering them invisible from even a few feet away. The dangers are not merely from altitude or exposure, but from the mountain's sheer physical unpredictability. The scree slopes are notorious for shifting underfoot, and the rapid cycles of freezing and thawing destabilize the rock, turning stable paths into treacherous, sliding debris fields without warning. Every spring, when the snow begins to consolidate, the standard route up the mountain, known as Avalanche Gulch, becomes a highway for those attempting to reach the summit. It is a steep, relentless ascent that passes a prominent snowbound basin called Lake Helen, a common staging ground for climbers before they make their final push to the top. The gulch is infamous for its rockfall and its capacity for rapid, violent weather shifts. A party can be bathed in warm, alpine sunlight one moment and caught in a blinding, disorienting whiteout the next, with visibility dropping to mere feet. It is a mountain that demands absolute focus, yet it also presents an illusion of safety, because the path is so well defined and the summit is so clearly visible from the camp below. It was on this route, on a day that began with clear, stable weather, that Carl Landers, a 69-year-old resident of Uinta, California, stepped into the mystery that has defined the upper reaches of this volcano for decades. Carl Landers was not an amateur. He was a man with a specific, disciplined objective: to climb the highest peak in every county in California. He was fit, he was well acquainted with the hazards of high-altitude travel, and he was part of a competent group of climbers who had set out on May 25, 1999, to check Shasta off his list. They reached the area around Lake Helen, but as the air grew thin and the effort of the climb began to tell, Landers realized that he was not feeling well. In a display of the caution common to experienced mountaineers, he made the decision that most instructors would praise. He chose to turn back. He told his companions that he would return to the base of the mountain alone, descending the established, well-traveled route they had just ascended. It was a simple, logical, and safe decision. He was turning his back on the summit, heading toward the parking lot, back toward the ordinary world of his life in Uinta. His companions continued upward, expecting to find him at the base of the mountain in a few hours. They never saw him again. When the team descended to the designated meeting point, the camp was empty. There was no sign of Landers, no gear left behind, no indication that he had ever arrived at the car. The alarm was raised almost immediately, triggering a massive, multi-agency effort that would become one of the most exhaustive searches in the history of Siskiyou County. The U.S. Forest Service, professional mountain rescue teams, and volunteers combed the gulch, the surrounding ridges, and the drainages that spilled off the flanks of the volcano. Helicopters crisscrossed the slopes, their crews scanning the snow and the barren rock for any sign of a person, a jacket, a boot print, or a pack. The searchers went over every inch of the path he was presumed to have taken, and then they moved into the adjacent basins, looking into every crevice and behind every boulder where a man might fall or seek shelter. They found nothing. The search operation was a logistical Herculean task. Over several days, dozens of elite search and rescue personnel faced the same volatile conditions that had likely claimed landers. They navigated the dangerous, steep snowfields of Avalanche Gulch, often putting their own lives at risk to probe the deep runnels and the expansive, featureless snow basins. Despite the use of sophisticated aerial infrared imaging, which was meant to detect body heat against the cold mountain mass, the effort yielded zero results. In the aftermath, the Landers family was left with a hollow, agonizing void. There was no closure, no memorial site, and no physical evidence to process. The investigation by local authorities, which eventually scaled back due to the lack of any actionable leads, was forced to conclude that Landers had either suffered a catastrophic medical event or an accident that left him perfectly hidden by the mountain's vast, fractured terrain. The vanishing of Carl Landers remains a stubborn, unsettling fact. In the weeks and months that followed, the search grid was expanded, then refined, then searched again. Shasta is a mountain that usually gives up its secrets in the form of gear or remains once the snow melts. But in this case, the mountain remained silent. There was no foul play suspected, no evidence of a struggle, and no logical reason for a man to simply evaporate on a route that is traversed by hundreds of climbers every season. He was on the safest part of his climb, heading down a slope he had already navigated, yet he was erased as completely as if he had never been there. The case remains unsolved, a cold file in a Siskiyou County cabinet, and it is far from an isolated incident in the history of this particular peak. Shasta has a documented recurring pattern of people walking into its slopes and disappearing without a trace, their fates swallowed by the same volcanic scree that Carl Landers walked across that May morning. These disappearances share a chilling commonality. They often occur in broad daylight, on well-marked high-traffic trails, and involve experienced hikers who simply vanish during short, routine transitions. Why these cases resist explanation is a question that haunts the search and rescue community. There is no single environmental factor that accounts for the totality of the loss, suggesting that the mountain's scale and its chaotic hidden fissures create a perfect natural vacuum that defies standard search parameters. It is easy to look at the mystique of Shasta and imagine that there is some hidden, strange explanation for these losses, but the mountain's reality is much more mundane and, in its own way, much more terrifying. The danger of Shasta is not the unusual. It is the absolute indifference of its scale. It is a massive vertical world that can hide a person behind a single ridge or bury them under a late-season slide in a matter of seconds. When the weather closes in, the mountain becomes a blank slate, and the trails that look so permanent in the summer are easily lost to the shifting, blinding reality of the high altitude. Carl Landers did everything right, and the mountain took him anyway, proving that in the high country, the line between a successful summit and a permanent disappearance is often nothing more than a few hundred yards and a change in the wind. The searchers eventually stopped looking, the files grew dusty, and the mountain continued its slow, silent rotation above the valley floor, keeping the secret of where it had placed him. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a mountain range once the last searcher has packed his gear and left. It is a heavy, permanent quiet that suggests the landscape has finally reclaimed the person who was once part of it. Throughout the western ranges, from the granite teeth of Idaho to the volcanic heights of California, this silence is the only witness to what happens when the gear fails or the path disappears. In the case of Shasta, The silence is compounded by the sheer, imposing presence of the volcano itself, a peak that looms over the geography of the West, like a monument to things that cannot be named. It is a reminder that even when we think we have mastered the wilderness, when we have maps and satellite devices and the wisdom of decades of climbing, we are still just visitors in a country that is not designed for us. We walk up into the light and the thin air, and we assume we will walk back down, but the mountains are under no obligation to let us leave. Shasta took a careful man on the safest part of his climb, and has never said where. Above the sprawl of Los Angeles, another mountain, a wall of wilderness most of the city never notices, would take a face the whole world knew. The San Gabriel Mountains do not look like a place where a man can be erased. They rise as a gargantuan jagged wall directly off the northern edge of the Los Angeles basin, a sprawling range of crumbling granite and steep, brush-choked canyons that serve as the high, wild backdrop to the lives of 18 million people. At their center stands Mount San Antonio, known to almost everyone as Mount Baldy. At just over 10,000 feet, it is the highest point in the range, a summit that dominates the local horizon and acts as a siren song for thousands of hikers, weekenders, and seasoned mountaineers who see its snow-capped peak from the city streets and feel the pull of the thin air. It is a range of profound contradictions. It is accessible by a 40-minute drive from the heart of a metropolis, yet its terrain is as unforgiving as any remote backcountry in the West. The rock here is notoriously loose and fractured, a geological formation known for its instability, where entire sections of mountainside can slough off after heavy rains. The canyons are choked with dense, impenetrable chaparral, manzanita, and scrub oak so thick they can tear clothing and blind an explorer. And in the winter, the summit ridge, the infamous Devil's Backbone, turns into a gauntlet of ice and wind-scoured snow that has claimed the lives of the unprepared and the experienced alike. The danger of the San Gabriels is often underestimated precisely because of their proximity to civilization. A hiker can leave a trailhead in the morning, under a bright Southern California sun, and within a few thousand feet of climbing, find themselves on a narrow, icy, knife-edge ridge, miles from the nearest road, where a single slip on frozen crust can send a person sliding into a drainage so deep and tangled that no searcher on the ground can see the bottom. It is a mountain that demands respect, yet its visibility invites a dangerous degree of casualness. The slopes are marked by hidden vertical drops and limestone chutes that act as natural funnels for ice and debris. In January of 2023, the range was enduring one of the most severe and unstable winters in recent memory. Record snowfall had blanketed the peaks, followed by violent freezing storms that transformed the high country routes into frozen, avalanche-prone chutes. It was against this backdrop of volatile, high-altitude hazard that a 65-year-old British actor and lifelong mountaineer named Julian set out for a solo hike on the slopes of Mount Baldy. Sands was no novice. He was an experienced, conditioned climber who had spent decades navigating high-altitude terrain, and he was intimately familiar with the demands of winter mountaineering. On the morning of January 13th, 2023, he ascended into the high country, and when he failed to return as scheduled, his family raised the alarm. What followed was one of the most intensive, prolonged, and logistically complex search and rescue operations in the modern history of the San Gabriel Mountains. Because of the extreme weather, the searchers were fighting a losing battle against the range itself. 8 separate missions were launched over the following months, involving over 500 man-hours, ground crews, drone teams, and helicopters equipped with specialized infrared sensors. The search effort was complicated by the sheer scale of the vertical landscape. Search and rescue teams had to contend with extreme wind gusts that often grounded helicopters, while ground crews faced the risk of triggering the very avalanches they were meant to be searching under. Time and again, the searchers were forced to turn back. The avalanche risk was so high that it was deemed too dangerous to put teams into the upper reaches of the mountain. For weeks, the range remained locked in a deep, frozen silence, its slopes battered by relentless storms that seemed to erase the very possibility of finding a trace of the man who had walked up into them. The search was hampered by the physical reality of the terrain. The San Gabriels are characterized by blind topography. A body could be lying only a few hundred feet from a major trail, yet be entirely obscured by the deep, V-shaped gorges, the dense canopy of trees, or the shifting snowpack that buries everything in its path. Even with the integration of cellular pings and sophisticated mapping technology, the ruggedness of the mountains created a series of dead zones where modern tech failed to penetrate. For those managing the search, it became a heartbreaking exercise in probability, as the mountain's vastness seemed to swallow every attempt at discovery. The weather did more than just hide the missing, it actively erased evidence. As the snow melted and refroze, it acted as a geological conveyor belt, moving items, clothing, and remains downward into lower, even more inaccessible drainages, far from where a hiker would typically be expected to lose their footing. The mystery was not that he had gone missing, it was that, in the age of satellite tracking and high-resolution aerial surveillance, a prominent figure could remain entirely lost in a range so thoroughly surveyed and so densely populated by hikers. As the winter faded and the spring thaw began to expose the upper basins, the search continued, but the mountain gave nothing back. It felt as though the landscape had simply accepted him, tucking him away into some unreachable fold of the earth. The agony for those left waiting was not just the loss, but the absolute, crushing lack of clarity. Was he in the high chutes, buried under a shifting slide of snow, or had he succumbed to the cold in a lower canyon, hidden by the very thickets of brush that make the San Gabriels so difficult to traverse? The range offered no clues. The psychological toll on the searchers was as significant as the physical one, as they were forced to confront the reality that despite the mobilization of resources, the mountain remained a fortress of silence. The San Gabriels possess a documented grim history of such disappearances. Over the decades, dozens of hikers have vanished into these canyons, often leaving behind nothing but a parked car at a trailhead. These cases frequently resist explanation because the variables are so extreme. The temperature drops rapidly as the sun dips behind the peaks. The terrain is prone to sudden rockfalls, and the dense, vertical nature of the canyons makes conventional searching nearly impossible. Many of these missing persons are never found, their remains obscured by decades of mountain growth and erosion, leaving the families in a state of indefinite, painful suspension. In the case of Sands, the mountain's refusal to yield him for months highlighted the brutal disparity between our confidence in modern search capabilities and the raw, untamable power of the San Gabriel wilderness. It was not until the summer, 5 months after he had been reported missing, that the mountain finally yielded the truth. On June 24th, 2023, a group of hikers exploring the drainage known as Good Canyon, a rugged, remote area situated at a lower elevation than the summit peaks, stumbled upon personal items scattered across the landscape. They found boots, trekking poles, clothing, and a wallet containing identification that belonged to Julian Sands. The discovery prompted a final, conclusive search by the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. They recovered his remains in a relatively flat section of the canyon, a place where he had come to rest, but the circumstances of his final hours remained as elusive as they had been on the day he disappeared. When the coroner's report was eventually filed, the cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. The condition of the remains, exposed for months to the elements and the wildlife of the San Gabriels, made a definitive medical conclusion impossible. There were theories, of course. Some pointed to a high-altitude fall, others to an avalanche that could have swept him down into the drainage, and others still to the possibility of a simple, fatal misstep that led to an injury he could not overcome. But none could be proven. He had been found in a location that suggested he had been moving through the backcountry, and he had been caught by the same indifferent cruelty that the range exerts on everyone who enters it. He was not a victim of a crime, nor was he lost in an impossible landscape. He was a man who had met an invisible, sudden end in a canyon that simply refused to give up its secret for half a year. The aftermath for his family was a painful transition from the frantic hope of a rescue to the quiet finality of a recovery. While the discovery of his remains offered a grim closure, it left the fundamental questions of his final journey unanswered, an emptiness that the recovery of a wallet and boots could not fill. The investigation concluded that no foul play was involved, confirming the suspicion that the mountain itself was the architect of the tragedy. Yet, the lack of a cause of death leaves a lingering shadow over the event, a reminder that the environment can be so thoroughly destructive that it denies us the ability to understand how a life was taken. The case of Julian Sands serves as a stark reminder that even a face known to millions, and even an athlete of his caliber, is no match for the unpredictability of the San Gabriels. The mountain does not care who you are or what you have climbed before. It is a place that can swallow a person in plain sight of a city, and it is a place where the final answer to a life's end can remain unwritten, even after the body has been returned. It is a sobering, quiet truth that lingers long after the news cycles have moved on. The San Gabriels are a deceptive wall, a range that looks like a playground but operates like a trap, and even when it finally relents and gives back what it has taken, it does so with a cold, silent refusal to explain how or why. Even a face the whole world knew could vanish for 5 months, a short flight from Los Angeles, and even then the mountain kept the answer. But at least Baldy gave him back. In the high Sierra, a schoolteacher walked into the range one summer day and left only a few torn pages pointing toward the peaks. In the San Gabriels, a man walked into the white, and for 5 months the mountain held on to him, proving that the proximity of civilization is no defense against the ancient, indifferent gravity of the high country. The Sierra Nevada is not merely a mountain range, it is a monolith of stone and ice that defines the western edge of the American continent. Stretching 400 miles along the spine of California, the Sierra is, at its heart, a massive, uplifted block of granite that has been scoured and polished by millennia of glacial movement. It is a landscape of impossible scale, containing the highest peaks in the contiguous United States, thousands of alpine lakes nestled in basins of shattered rock, and vast, high-altitude plateaus that can strip a person of their strength in a single afternoon. To stand at the edge of the minarets, a jagged black volcanic sub-range of the Rita Range, is to look upon a skyline that seems designed to repel the human presence. It is a place of sharp, vertical spires that rise like the ruins of a Gothic cathedral, surrounded by fields of talus and deep-shadowed cirques where the snow rarely fully departs. In the height of summer, the air is thin and the sun is blinding, reflecting off the granite until the landscape glows with an intensity that justifies John Muir's famous epithet, the range of light. But beneath that light lies a profound, indifferent silence. The terrain here is not merely steep, it is deceptively complex. The minarets are composed of metamorphic rock that sits in stark contrast to the surrounding batholith, resulting in a fractured, unstable environment. The scale of this danger is difficult to communicate to those who have not stood amidst the spires. The talus slopes, piles of loose, angular rock, often act as a fluid surface, capable of shifting under a single bootfall to send a hiker tumbling into concealed crevasses or narrow, chimney-like fissures. A person can be obscured by a boulder the size of a carriage or fall into a moat between the snowfield and the rock face, becoming effectively invisible to searchers passing just yards above. It was into this country that Matthew Greene, a 39-year-old high school mathematics teacher from Pennsylvania, ventured in the summer of 2013. Greene was a man of orderly habits, a climber who understood the weight of preparation, and he had come to the Mammoth Lakes area for a solitary summer trek. By all accounts, his trip was unfolding as planned until a mechanical failure left his car in the shop, forcing him to extend his stay in the region. He was a man with time on his hands and a map of some of the most rugged, beautiful, and unforgiving wilderness in the country spread before him. On July 16th, he spoke with his parents for the last time. He was in high spirits, talking of his plans to head out into the Ansel Adams wilderness for one more long day in the mountains. He told them he would check back in when he returned. He never did. The disappearance of Matthew Greene was not a case of a hiker who wandered off a path in confusion. It was the vanishing of an experienced person who walked into a landscape he had chosen with deliberate intent. When he failed to make contact and his campsite near Mammoth Lakes was checked, investigators found it in a state of unsettling, frozen order. It was tidy, undisturbed, and seemingly waiting for his return. His gear was accounted for, and in his belongings, searchers discovered a piece of evidence that would become the focal point of the investigation. A mountaineering guidebook, with pages torn out and set aside. Those pages, missing from the binding, described routes and peaks within the minarets and the Ritter Range. It was a silent paper trail pointing directly into the most treacherous, glaciated, and inaccessible terrain in the Sierra. The search that followed was one of the most comprehensive in the history of the region. It involved dozens of personnel from multiple agencies, including the Mono County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team, who contended with extreme fluctuations in temperature and the sheer physical exhaustion of operating at 10,000 to 12,000 feet. For days, helicopters crisscrossed the jagged, serrated ridges of the minarets, their pilots scanning the deep, dark drainages for any sign of a flash of color or a displaced rock. Ground teams combed the timberline and the high exposed benches, and cadaver dogs were deployed across the high-altitude basins where a body might lie hidden by the very scale of the terrain. The searchers looked for a man who had clearly intended to be there, yet they found nothing. No footprints in the dust of a pass, no discarded equipment, no sign of a distress signal or a makeshift camp. The wilderness, vast and vertical, had simply absorbed him. The logistical difficulty of this search cannot be overstated. The terrain in the minarets is so rugged that ground teams often had to spend as much time navigating the geology as they did looking for clues. The searchers were forced to contend with false positives, the way shadows in deep vertical canyons can mimic the shape of a person, or the way a patch of white lichen on gray rock can look, from a helicopter, like a discarded piece of nylon. As the days turned into weeks, the focus of the search shifted from a rescue operation to a recovery, and finally to a somber, open-ended mystery. The family, left in the agonizing limbo of the unknown, faced the reality that for all the technology and expertise brought to bear, the mountains remained an impenetrable barrier. No clothing, no personal effects, and no forensic evidence ever surfaced to explain the final hours of the mathematics teacher. The mystery of Matthew Greene is deepened by the total absence of physical evidence. In the years since his disappearance, his bank accounts have remained untouched, his phone has never pinged a tower, and no hiker has ever stumbled upon a trace of his passage. This is the enduring, cold reality of the Sierra Nevada. It is a range so enormous that a person can step a mile off a trail and enter a world where the rock faces are hundreds of feet high and the scree slopes are prone to shifting under the slightest weight. It is a place where a single misstep on an exposed ridge or a sudden localized collapse of loose rock can leave a person obscured by the very geology they came to admire. There are countless documented cases in the Sierra of individuals who were never seen again, or who were found only years later by sheer, blind luck, their remains resting just a few hundred feet from a path that thousands of people walk every summer. These disappearances form a haunting, documented pattern in the High Sierra. Seasoned outdoorsmen, families on day hikes, and solo mountaineers alike have vanished in areas that, while popular, possess dead zones of visibility. The geography of the Sierra is uniquely suited to hiding the lost. The combination of deep, glacial-carved canyons and high-altitude, boulder-strewn plateaus creates an environment where a human body can be consumed by the landscape, covered by snowdrifts that persist for years, or hidden beneath rockfall triggered by seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. These cases resist explanation because they lack the breadcrumb trail typically left by human distress. There are no abandoned packs, no calls for help, and no identifiable path of travel. It is as if the individuals simply ceased to occupy the three-dimensional space they were walking through. There is an eerie, persistent logic to these disappearances. The Sierra does not need to be haunted to be lethal. It only needs to be vast. When a person ventures into the high granite of the Ritter Range, they are entering a landscape of immense geological time that functions on a scale entirely removed from the human experience. The wind in the high passes, the cold that settles into the cirques after sunset, and the sheer, unending repetition of granite spires create a disorientation that can settle over even the most competent climber. Matthew Greene walked toward the minarets with a plan, a guidebook, and the capability of a seasoned outdoorsman. He stepped out of the light of the lower valleys and into the high, black shadows of the spires, and in the space of a single day, the mountains closed over him so effectively that he ceased to be a person and became part of the geography. His case remains open, a quiet testament to the fact that in the High Sierra, some questions are never answered and some absences are never filled. The searchers moved on. The seasons cycled through their inevitable, brutal changes, and the rocks of the minarets remained exactly as they were before he arrived. Silent, indifferent, and absolute. The Sierra keeps its secrets in the deep, untrodden basins and the vertical faces of its highest peaks, and it does not offer an explanation for why one man can walk into the sunlit granite and never be heard from again. Matthew Greene pointed himself at the minarets and stepped out of the world. In the far northwest, a woman would eat lunch on a summit, start down a peak she knew well, and leave searchers nothing but a single boot print in 22 days of looking. The North Cascades are often spoken of as the American Alps, a title that suggests a certain romantic grandeur. But the name does little to capture the sheer, unforgiving verticality of the country. Stretching across the northern reaches of Washington, these are not mountains that slope. They are mountains that soar, a dense, glaciated, and deeply fractured world of granite spires and vertical forest. To step off the pavement in the North Cascades is to enter a terrain so complex that the maps are often mere suggestions. The peaks here are serrated, separated by deep, dark drainages, and tangled with vegetation so thick it can hide a person from a search team standing 20 feet away. Even in the height of summer, the rock remains cold, the ravines hold lingering snow, and the weather can cycle from sun-drenched granite to freezing, blinding cloud in the time it takes to eat a sandwich. It is a range of immense, brooding beauty, but it is also a place where the margin for error is measured in inches and where the transition from a marked trail to a lethal, hidden abyss can happen in a single blind step. The scale of this landscape is deceptive. What appears to be a manageable ridgeline from a satellite view is, on the ground, a labyrinth of cliffing out, where a hiker reaches a point of no return, blocked by sheer, unscalable drops that force a perilous backtrack. The geology here is shattered and loose, a result of millions of years of tectonic grinding and glacial scouring. This creates what climbers call choss, or unstable rock, which can shift under a boot with the suddenness of a trapdoor. Between the peaks lie drainage systems that drop thousands of feet into dense, old-growth timber, where the canopy is so thick it filters out the light, creating a perpetual twilight even at noon. In these basins, the moss-slicked boulders and hidden creek beds create a subterranean world beneath the forest floor, a place where a person could fall into a crevice or a hidden drainage and remain entirely concealed from even the most sophisticated aerial sensors. South of the national park, along the winding, narrow artery known as the Mountain Loop Highway, the forest grows deep and the peaks become less famous, but no less lethal. Here, the landscape is defined by the steep, technical slopes of peaks like Vesper, a mountain that draws steady traffic from the Seattle hiking community. It is a classic Cascade summit, a pyramid of granite slabs, boulder fields, and sweeping exposed gullies. The climb is strenuous, requiring a trek through the Sunrise Mine Trail and up the switchbacks of Headley Pass, where the path narrows and the world falls away on either side. It is the kind of place that invites a person to look at the view and forget the ground beneath their feet. It was here, on a clear morning in the first week of August 2018, that a hiker named Samantha Sayers set out for a day in the mountains she had come to know well. Samantha was 27, an experienced hiker who understood the rhythms of the Cascades. She had prepared for the ascent of Vesper Peak with the quiet confidence of someone who had climbed dozens of similar summits. The record of her day is remarkably clear, a sequence of events that highlights exactly how ordinary and how fragile a mountain excursion can be. She signed the trailhead register. She made the climb. She reached the summit, where she was seen by other hikers, photographed at her lunch, and appeared entirely at ease. There was no sign of distress, no storm on the horizon, no equipment failure reported. She was a woman in her prime, on a popular peak, under a high, blue summer sun. She told her partner she would be back down by the evening, and she began the descent that for every other hiker on the mountain that day ended in the familiar comfort of the trailhead parking lot. But Samantha Sayers did not return. When the clock ticked past the hour she was expected to check in, the silence from the mountain began to take on a physical weight. The search that followed became one of the most intense and sustained operations in the recent history of the North Cascades. For 22 days, the mountain was essentially under siege. More than a dozen different agencies, sheriffs, mountain rescue units, federal land managers, poured into the drainage. The logistical difficulty was staggering. Rescuers had to navigate steep, unstable scree slopes, where every step risked triggering rockfall onto the teams below. They brought with them the entire arsenal of modern search technology: thermal imaging aircraft that swept the granite slabs from the sky, heat-sensitive cameras, and specialized K9 teams trained to pick up a scent on rock that is notoriously difficult for dogs. Technical climbers hung from ropes in the gullies, scanning the ledges and the brush, while ground teams combed the boulder fields until their boots wore thin. The scope of this search operation was unprecedented for the area. Rescue teams rappelled into vertical chimneys that had never been explored, and drones were deployed to capture high-definition imagery of crevices that were physically inaccessible to humans. Yet, the mountain fought back. The searchers were constantly hampered by false positives, glints of sun on mica-flecked granite, or the peculiar way shadows played across the gullies, mimicking the shape of a person. They contended with the sheer scale of the drainage, which drops thousands of feet in distance, meaning that a hiker who slipped just a few feet off the trail could tumble into a vast, boulder-strewn basin that would take days to traverse. Every square inch of the terrain that Samantha might have reasonably traversed was scrutinized. And as the days turned into weeks, the searchers were met with an agonizing, sterile reality. They found no discarded jacket, no stray piece of gear, no sign of a fall, and no evidence of a struggle. In 22 days of exhaustive multi-agency effort, the only thing the mountain yielded was a single, ambiguous boot print found in the high, steep country below the summit. A trace that was never definitively linked to her, and which ultimately led nowhere. It was a cruel tease, a fragment of evidence that offered no direction, no path, and no closure. Then, as the search resources were exhausted, and the terrain became too hazardous to justify further risk to the rescuers, the operation was formally suspended. The aftermath was a vacuum of information that devastated those left behind. Samantha's family, refusing to accept the silence of the wilderness, organized their own private efforts, returning to the slopes of Vesper Peak long after the official helicopters had ceased their rhythmic thrumming. They navigated the same crushing grief that haunts the families of all missing hikers. The agonizing lack of a body which denies them the finality of a burial and leaves them in a state of perpetual, suspended mourning. The investigation, while thorough, eventually stalled for the simple lack of a lead. Forensic experts and search coordinators were left to speculate on the what-ifs, a medical event, a sudden stumble, or a freak accident that buried her beneath the shifting talus. But without a body, every theory remained a hollow ghost. The vanishing of Samantha Sayers stands as one of the most unsettling, purely unexplained mysteries in the Pacific Northwest. It was not a case of a hiker wandering into the vast, unknown backcountry of a national park. It was a disappearance from the face of a popular, heavily trafficked peak in the middle of a perfect August day. There is no trail-side evidence of what became of her, no forensic trail to explain how a human being could simply cease to be in a place where people were looking for her within hours. The silence of Vesper Peak has been absolute. In the years since, her family has continued to return to those slopes, searching for the answer that the search teams could not find. But the granite has kept its secret. This disappearance belongs to a broader, disturbing pattern in the North Cascades and the surrounding ranges. Throughout the history of these peaks, there have been documented cases of individuals, experienced outdoorsmen, professional guides, and seasoned athletes who have simply vanished from well-marked paths or established summits. These cases resist explanation because they lack the hallmarks of conventional accidents. There are rarely cries for help, no items left behind, and no tracks leading into the brush. Search and rescue experts often speak of the absorption phenomenon, where a person falls, is covered by shifting rock or dense vegetation, and is effectively erased from the landscape within minutes. The North Cascades are, in a sense, a machine that processes mass. The intense rain, the constant rockfall, and the rapid growth of the understory are forces of nature that work to sanitize the evidence of human presence. It is a reminder that the North Cascades do not require a catastrophe to claim someone. They do not need an avalanche or a bear or a violent storm. They only need the geography of the high, fractured slopes, the hidden gullies, the deceptive ledges, and the way the mountain can absorb a person into its folds so completely that even a search of weeks leaves the landscape looking as empty as it did the day before. The mountain, in its massive, indifferent way, simply closed the door. And as the searchers looked down into the deep, dark drainages of the Cascades, they were left with the same question that has haunted every major rescue operation in the American West. How can a person be here, in the light, and then, in the space of a single mile, be nowhere at all? 22 days on Vesper Peak, and the mountains gave up one boot print. But no vanishing in the West has gnawed at investigators like the next. A young athlete who went for a run in the Wind River foothills in daylight and left her car by the road with the keys still in it. In the high country of Wyoming, where the Continental Divide reaches its most jagged and uncompromising summit, lies the Wind River Range. To those who visit, the winds are defined by a scale that feels less like a mountain range and more like a tectonic wound in the earth. It is a massive, granite-backed spine running nearly 100 miles, holding the state's highest point at Gannett Peak and the largest collection of glaciers in the American Rockies. It is a place of austere beauty, where the high alpine basins are scoured by winds that never truly sleep, and where the distances between points on a map are measured in days, not hours. The range remains one of the least accessible stretches of wilderness in the lower 48, a vast, roadless expanse where a person who steps off the trail, or even one who simply walks into the foothills, can be effectively erased from the map by the sheer verticality and the indifferent, sprawling scale of the country. The terrain here is characterized by an almost prehistoric ruggedness. Beneath the jagged ridgelines lie thousands of glacial cirques and deep, boulder-strewn canyons that act as natural funnels for weather and gravity. The backcountry is defined by its erratic topography. One moment a hiker traverses a flat, deceptively gentle alpine meadow, and the next, they are confronted by vertical talus slopes and impenetrable thickets of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. The danger is not merely the height, but the volatility. Summer storms roll off the divide with terminal intensity, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees in minutes and turning dry, rocky gullies into impassable, mud-choked sluices. It is a landscape that encourages overconfidence in the fit and the prepared, yet it hides hazards, hidden crevasses in the glaciers, unstable rock shelves, and vast, undulating expanses of scree that can turn a simple misstep into an inescapable trap. The eastern foothills above the town of Landa serve as the transition point where the high desert rises into the pine-covered slopes of the Shoshone National Forest. It is a landscape of deceptive quietude, where the paved road gives way to the gravel of the loop road, a winding scenic route that climbs toward the high basins of Burnt Gulch. On a summer afternoon, the air is thin and clear, and the vistas look like an invitation to run, to hike, or simply to take the measure of a vast horizon. It was here, on the 24th of July in 1997, that a 24-year-old woman named Amy Wroe Bechtel went missing. Amy was a person of immense vitality, a gifted runner, a recent college athlete, and a newlywed who had built a life in the shadow of the mountains she loved. She had spent the day preparing for a 10-kilometer race she was helping to organize, a route that required her to survey the roads and trails in the foothills above Lander. She was seen in town that afternoon, focused on the tasks of a busy life. And then she drove her white Toyota Tercel up into the mountains to finalize the logistics of the event. She was moving through a landscape she knew well, in the middle of a clear, bright summer day, well within the reach of a community that knew her face. She did not return that evening, and when the sun went down behind the peaks, the search for her began. The discovery that followed in the early hours of the next morning set the tone for a mystery that has endured for nearly 3 decades. At roughly 1 o'clock in the morning, searchers located her vehicle parked along the loop road near Burnt Gulch. The car was undisturbed, a white shell against the backdrop of the pines, but the details inside were what unsettled the investigators. The car was unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition. Inside, the documents and maps she had been using to plan her race were still present, including a to-do list that spoke to the mundane, forward-looking nature of a life interrupted. Of Amy, there was no sign. There were no tracks, no abandoned gear, and no indication of a struggle or a sudden departure. She had been there, and then, in the span of a single afternoon, she had simply ceased to be. The search that ensued was one of the largest in Wyoming's history. It drew hundreds of volunteers, specialized search and rescue teams, and aircraft that combed the steep timber and the high granite benches of the Wind River Range for weeks. The operation was hampered by the very geography that defined the region. Searchers had to navigate dense, tangled forests that obscured line of sight from the air, and deep, labyrinthine gullies that made ground movement agonizingly slow. Cadaver dogs were deployed, tracking through the thick scent of pine and sage. But the rugged, high-altitude environment often neutralized their efficacy, as the shifting mountain thermals scattered scents across miles of broken terrain. They pushed into the drainage of the loop road, scrambled through the dense forest of the foothills, and scaled the ridges that lead toward the high peaks. They looked for the evidence that a mountain accident leaves behind: a lost hiker, a fall, an injury in the brush. But the mountains were silent. As the weeks stretched into months, the scope of the investigation expanded, and it became clear that this was not a simple case of a hiker who had wandered off the path. It was something else, something that refused to settle into the familiar categories of wilderness loss. The aftermath for the Bechtel family was a prolonged, agonizing suspension of reality. While the community of Lander rallied, the lack of a physical trace left a vacuum that no amount of searching could fill. Investigators returned to the site of the car many times, scouring the immediate vicinity for overlooked evidence. Yet the forest yielded nothing. No torn fabric, no scuff marks, no displaced stones. The investigation broadened to include potential connections to other unsolved crimes in the region. Looking for links that might explain her disappearance through the lens of human malice rather than natural misadventure. Yet, every avenue of inquiry, from the forensic examination of the vehicle to the exhaustive vetting of local persons of interest, ended in a cul-de-sac of missing variables. The broader pattern of disappearances in the Wind River Range reflects the same unnerving silence. Over the years, other travelers have vanished into the high country, leaving behind only the ghosts of their intended paths. These cases often share a common DNA: an experienced individual, a sudden departure from a known location, and an absolute lack of physical evidence despite rigorous large-scale search efforts. The terrain resists explanation because it is so vast and so unforgiving that a body can be buried by a simple rockfall, obscured by the rapid growth of mountain flora, or carried into the deep, unreachable cracks of the granite base. The silence of the winds is not merely the absence of sound. It is the presence of an environment that naturally disposes of evidence, making the search for a missing person feel like a search for a memory. In the years that followed, the case of Amy Wroe Bechtel became a singular, haunting presence in the region. Authorities and investigators pursued every lead, examining the possibility of a wilderness accident, the idea that she might have been struck down or incapacitated in a remote area where the terrain hides everything from those who look for it. Simultaneously, the investigation touched upon the possibility of foul play, as the circumstances of the unlocked car and the lack of physical evidence at the site left open doors that could not be closed. Over the decades, various persons of interest were scrutinized, and countless tips were followed to their ends. Yet the case remained, and remains, officially unsolved. No body was ever recovered. No definitive evidence of a crime was ever produced. The mountains kept their secret, and in 2004, she was declared legally dead, though the search for answers continued in the minds of those who could not let the silence stand. The mystery of the Wind River Range is not found in a specific peak or a hidden canyon. It is found in the way the wilderness can accommodate a person's total absence. Amy Bechtel was a runner in her prime, an athlete who knew the country, vanishing from a road in the middle of the day. The Wind River Range remains a place where the scale is so vast and the terrain so indifferent to human activity that a person can be in the middle of a well-traveled route one moment and gone from the record of the world the next. It is the archetype of the vanishing, where the car stands as a monument to a person who has simply stepped out of the frame of existence. The winds took Amy Bechtel in broad daylight and left only a car by the road, and no one has ever been able to say what happened. But for sheer age and strangeness, No range on this list matches the one that swallowed a treasure hunter in the Arizona desert and gave back a skull with a hole in either side. The Superstition Mountains rise abruptly from the floor of the Sonoran Desert, a jagged, volcanic fortress of red rock and shadow located just east of the sprawling heat of Phoenix, Arizona. To the uninitiated, they might appear as nothing more than a sun-bleached range of unremarkable ridges, but within the Tonto National Forest, the Superstitions transform into a disorienting, labyrinthine nightmare. They are a jumble of box canyons that lead nowhere, vertical basalt cliffs that sheer off into nothing, and deep, dry washes that can turn a simple afternoon walk into a dehydrating trap of blinding glare and shifting perspective. At the center of this range stands Weaver's Needle, a monolithic spire of stone that has served as a lighthouse for the lost and a siren for the obsessed for over a century. The range is a place where the landscape itself seems designed to confuse the human eye, its geology a fractured volcanic chaos that hides the ground in shadow and reflects the sun in a way that makes every direction look identical. It is a place that has been feared and mythologized since the first prospectors pushed into its heart, and for 90 years it has held onto a secret that has divided forensic experts, fueled local folklore, and remains, in the strictest sense, a case with no official conclusion. The scale of this terrain is deceptive. While the mountains cover only about 160,000 acres, the ruggedness of the topography creates a sensation of infinite, suffocating depth. The backcountry is composed of massive, crumbling volcanic tuff and sharp, knife-edged ridges that force hikers into narrow, heat-retaining corridors. In the height of summer, the ambient temperature can soar well past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, but the surface temperature of the exposed rock can reach nearly 160 degrees. This creates a lethal thermal environment where the body loses moisture faster than it can be replaced, often leading to rapid onset heat exhaustion, followed by delirium and cognitive impairment. In this state, an individual's sense of direction, already compromised by the repetitive, chaotic geology of the range, collapses entirely. It is not uncommon for hikers to walk in perfect circles, their perception of distance warped by the shimmering heat waves that rise from the iron-rich soil. The legend that haunts the Superstitions is the story of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. It is a tale of a hidden, fabulously rich vein of ore that allegedly cost the lives of every man who ever dared to seek it. For generations, this folklore has acted as a grim magnet, drawing prospectors, dreamers, and the desperate into the canyons of the Tonto, and a staggering number of them have walked into those heat-shimmering ravines and never walked out. While the legend belongs to the realm of campfire stories and local lore, the disappearances that follow in its wake are cold, documented, and lethal. The desert does not require a curse to take a life. It requires only a misstep, a broken water jug, or the simple, cruel tendency of a man to lose his bearings in a maze of volcanic rock. In the summer of 1931, a man named Adolf Ruth became the most famous of these seekers. He was an aging amateur treasure hunter, a man who arrived in Arizona with a set of old, mysterious maps he believed pointed directly to the Dutchman's hoard. Despite a physical disability that left him with a stiff leg, he was determined. He engaged a local packer to carry him into the interior of the Superstitions, establishing a base camp in the heart of the most inhospitable country the range had to offer. He was looking for a fortune, and he was doing it in a place where the shade is a luxury and where water is almost entirely absent. Within days, Adolf Ruth had disappeared. The search that followed was one of the most intense in the history of the territory. Parties of volunteers and experienced outdoorsmen combed the canyons, braving the blistering heat, searching for the camp, the maps, or any sign of the man who had gone looking for a legend. The search operation was massive. involving local law enforcement, experienced trackers who knew the nuances of the canyons, and a public gripped by the mystery of the missing man. They found his camp, but they did not find him. For months, the Superstitions stayed silent. The failure of the search teams to locate him initially was attributed to the sheer verticality of the range, where a body could easily slip into a deep fissure or be obscured by the dense, thorny scrub of the desert floor. Then, in December of 1931, an expedition made a discovery that would turn a tragic disappearance into a national sensation. They found a human skull. It was later identified through dental records as belonging to Adolf Ruth, and it was quickly sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis by the noted anthropologist Alois Hrdlicka. The findings that followed ignited a firestorm of speculation that has never truly cooled. The report stated that the skull showed two distinct holes, a small entry point and a larger exit wound, suggesting to many that a firearm had been discharged at close range. The rest of the remains were eventually recovered, scattered some distance from the head. To the public and to the press of the 1930s, this was evidence of a dark, calculated end, the final chapter of the curse of the lost Dutchman. Yet the official reality was far more ambiguous. Decades later, a Maricopa County pathologist reviewing the original photographs of the remains argued that the fractures were not bullet wounds at all, but rather the result of geological weathering or animal scavenging. Arizona authorities, faced with the conflicting evidence and the passage of time, never held a criminal inquest. The official death certificate simply listed the cause as unknown. Whether Ruth succumbed to the relentless, parching thirst of the desert, or whether he met a more sinister fate at the hands of another, the Superstitions never confessed. The aftermath of the Ruth case cemented the Superstitions' reputation as a place where nature and mystery collide. His family, left with nothing but the questions surrounding his death, struggled to find closure as the press turned his disappearance into a sensationalized headline. The investigation was hampered from the start by the harsh, unforgiving environment, which rapidly degraded physical evidence, leaving investigators to rely on conjecture. The fact that his remains were found scattered some distance away suggested to some the work of scavengers, while others insisted it was the deliberate act of someone wanting to hide a crime. Because no evidence of a struggle or a camp disturbance was found in the proximity of the body, the case remains an enigma. There is a final lingering detail that often appears in the accounts of his passing. Among the items found near his remains was a note, allegedly written by Ruth himself, that ended with the Latin boast, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, along with a claimed assertion that he had finally located the mine. Whether this was the final delirious hope of a man dying in the sun or the genuine record of a discovery that died with him, it is impossible to say. It serves as a haunting epitaph for a man who went into the desert searching for a myth and became one himself. The Superstitions have never stopped claiming people. In 2009, nearly 80 years after Adolf Ruth was found, a young man named Jesse Capon disappeared in the same canyons. He too was obsessed with the legend of the Dutchman, and he too vanished into the volcanic maze. His disappearance triggered a massive, multi-year search effort that utilized aerial reconnaissance and specialized mountain rescue teams. His remains were not discovered until 3 years later, in 2012, wedged deep inside a narrow, nearly inaccessible crevice on the side of Tortilla Mountain. He had been so close to a route that searchers had crossed, yet he was effectively hidden by the very geography that defines the range. The desert does not distinguish between the treasure seeker of the 30s and the modern hiker of the 21st century. It treats them both with the same indifference. The range remains a place of intense, quiet scrutiny. It is a landscape where a skull can be both a piece of evidence and a symbol of a curse, where a death can be both a simple accident and an unsolved mystery, and where the land itself seems to hold onto its secrets with a singular, granite-hard resolve. The broader pattern of disappearances here is characterized by the sheer frequency of people vanishing in proximity to well-known landmarks, only to be found or never found in areas that seem defy logic. These cases resist explanation because the terrain itself is a biological and mechanical trap. The basalt rock interferes with navigation tools, the heat erodes the evidence of footprints within hours, and the canyons act as acoustic dampeners. The mine, if it ever existed, remains unfound, and the truth of what happens in the deep, shadow-filled canyons of the Tonto remains just as hidden. The superstitions have argued over a skull for 90 years and settled nothing, leaving behind only the question of what the desert keeps and what it eventually decides to return. But the strangest place of all is not a desert or a great glaciered peak. It is a single, low, green mountain in Vermont, where, in the span of 5 years, one person after another walked into the woods and was never seen again. In the southwestern corner of Vermont, where the Green Mountains rise in soft, rounded ridges draped in hardwoods and hemlock, there is a summit that looks like any other in the range. Glastenbury Mountain does not possess the jagged, dramatic profile of the high peaks of the West, nor does it loom over the landscape with the sudden, violent height of a major volcano. It is a quiet mountain, covered in a dense, tangled forest that seems to swallow the light, and it is marked by a long, slow history of failure. A logging boom in the late 19th century brought a railway and a town to its slopes, but both vanished almost as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind nothing but rusted iron, cellar holes, and a local reputation for being a place that does not hold on to the things of men. By the mid-20th century, the town of Glastenbury was a ghost of its former self, a place where the forest was aggressively reclaiming the clearings. It was against this backdrop of fading memory and thickening woods that the mountain became the site of a cluster of disappearances so concentrated and so utterly resistant to explanation that the region earned a nickname in the press of the era, the Bennington Triangle. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 separate people walked onto the slopes of Glastenbury or into the immediate wilderness surrounding it, and, in a span of time that now feels like a jagged hole in the history of the state, they simply ceased to be. The first was Mitty Rivers, a 74-year-old hunting guide who knew the terrain of the Green Mountains as well as any man in Vermont. In November of 1945, he was leading a party of hunters through the woods near the mountain's base. According to the accounts of those with him, Rivers stepped ahead of his group to scout the trail. He was a man of the woods, experienced and capable, but when the rest of the party reached the point where he had last been seen, there was no sign of him. The search that followed was exhaustive for the time, involving local residents and experienced outdoorsmen who combed the brush. But the mountain yielded nothing. After days of grid searches, the only physical evidence ever recovered was a single rifle cartridge found lying in the leaves. It was the only punctuation mark in a story that otherwise ended in total silence. The disappearance that would define the region, however, came a year later. On December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon, a sophomore at Bennington College, walked out of her dormitory and headed toward the Long Trail, the historic path that ribbons through the spine of the Vermont mountains. She was spotted by a local resident as she began her hike, described as wearing a bright red coat that would have been easily visible against the muted grays and browns of a Vermont December. She was seen by other hikers on the trail, moving toward the slopes of Glastenbury, but as the afternoon wore on and the temperature began to plummet, she did not return. The search for Weldon became one of the largest in the history of the Northeast to that point. Hundreds of people, students, soldiers from nearby camps, local volunteers and state officials scoured the ridgelines and the drainages. They spent weeks in the bitter cold, traversing the very ground where she had last been sighted. They found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of a red coat, no lost gear, no struggle, and no footprint. The disappearance of Paula Jean Weldon was so profound and so baffling that it became a catalyst for the formation of the Vermont State Police, as the public outcry and the sheer vacuum of evidence left the local authorities unable to process the loss. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved, a mystery that has never been tethered to a single clue or a single theory that the evidence can sustain. As the years passed, the mountain's reputation grew darker. In December 1949, a local man named James Tedford was reportedly traveling by bus from St. Albans back to Bennington. According to the accounts that emerged in the days that followed, Tedford was seen by other passengers in his seat as the bus neared its final destination. Yet, when the bus arrived at the terminal in Bennington, his seat was empty. His belongings, including his bus pass and other personal items, were still in the rack above his head, but Tedford was gone. While the circumstances of this disappearance are distinct from the others, the incident was quickly absorbed into the folklore of the region, cementing the idea that the woods around Glastenbury were a place where the ordinary rules of movement and presence simply ceased to apply. Whether he left the bus at an unscheduled stop or vanished in a manner that defied the witness accounts of those on board, he remained, like Rivers and Weldon, a person who had entered the orbit of the mountain and failed to exit it. The final two disappearances occurred in rapid succession in October 1950. The first was a young boy, Paul Jepson, who vanished while his mother was distracted for only a few minutes near a truck parked at the edge of the mountain's forest. Despite the speed of the alarm and the immediate mobilization of a search party, the woods provided no answers. Then, only weeks later, a woman in her 50s named Frida Langer went missing while hiking near the Somerset Reservoir, a body of water that sits in the shadow of the mountain. The search for Langer was massive, utilizing the lessons learned from the previous cases, and the terrain she had been hiking was crisscrossed by searchers multiple times. Yet, she was not found. Then, in May of 1951, 7 months after she had vanished, her remains were discovered in an area that had been systematically searched and researched during the initial effort. The condition of the remains meant that no clear cause of death could be determined. She was the only one of the 5 to ever be returned by the mountain, and her discovery only added to the mystery. The ground where she was found had been empty in the autumn, and it was suddenly not empty in the spring. These cases, taken together, form a pattern of absence that is as haunting as it is impossible to categorize. There is no single signature to these disappearances. They involved men and women, the young and the old, the experienced guide and the college student, the traveler on a bus, and the child near a road. There was no shared weather pattern, no common season, and no single location on the mountain that served as a focal point. They simply occurred, one after the other, in a landscape that is neither high nor particularly treacherous by the standards of the world's great ranges. The Bennington Triangle has since become a magnet for every imaginable theory, from the criminal to the inexplicable, but the documented reality is far simpler and far more chilling. 5 people entered a small, defined area of the Vermont woods and were erased from the world. No evidence links them to a common fate, and no evidence explains how they could have disappeared so completely